Imagine living in a quiet town where everything seems normal until you find out that the friendly giant down the street has been hiding a horrifying secret. A secret so dark, it shakes the entire community to its core. Today, we're diving into the chilling story of Kendall Francois, the man who turned his family home into a house of horrors. Stay with us as we unravel the twisted tale of a killer hiding in plain sight.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm thrilled to have you here as we dive into yet another gripping and unsettling case. Today, we're stepping into the shadows to uncover the terrifying story of Kendall Francois, the man whose seemingly normal life in Poughkeepsie hid a horrifying secret. From his quiet demeanor to the sinister events that unfolded within the walls of his family home, this case is sure to send shivers down your spine. So, buckle up, because this is one story you won't soon forget. In the sleepy town of Poughkeepsie, New York, there was a man named Kendall Francois, and if you ever saw him, you probably just think of him as a big, quiet guy. He wasn't someone who stood out, not in the way that people remember. He lived in a worn-down house with his parents and sister, a place that was almost as unremarkable as he was. But Kendall, he was something else entirely beneath that ordinary exterior. People in town saw him going about his business, working as a janitor at a local school. A simple job for a simple man, or so they thought. Kendall wasn't the kind of guy who had close friends, but he wasn't a total loner either. People might chat with him here and there, but no one really knew him. You know. He was just that quiet giant everyone sort of knew but didn't really think about. Kendall's family, they were your average working folks. His mom worked in healthcare, his dad was a bus driver, and his sister was just trying to get by. They lived together in that old house, where nothing much happened, at least. Not on the surface. The house itself was falling apart, like it hadn't seen a repairman in decades. But that didn't seem to bother the Francois family much. They went about their lives, not knowing that their home was becoming a house of horrors. Now, what no one knew was that Kendall had a very dark side. It wasn't like he suddenly snapped one day. This was a part of him that had been there, lurking, growing. It started slowly, almost like he was testing the waters. Women in the area, women who were struggling or down on their luck, started to disappear. At first, it wasn't even a blip on the radar, just another person gone missing in a tough town. But these disappearances were no accident. Kendall was behind them, using his size and quiet demeanor to lure these women to his home. Once there, they were trapped. He'd bring them into his room, a place that was more of a dungeon than anything else. And once they were inside, there was no getting out. Kendall had crossed the line, and he wasn't looking back. The strangest part, his family didn't suspect a thing. They lived in that house, walking past his room, not knowing what was happening just a few feet away. Kendall was careful, though. He kept his room locked, never letting anyone inside. And his family, well, they just assumed he was being his usual weird self. But as the bodies piled up, the stench in the house grew worse, and still, no one connected the dots. Kendall's secret was safe, at least for a while. The town of Poughkeepsie kept moving, unaware that a monster was living among them. But as more women vanished, the police began to take notice. This wasn't just bad luck or coincidence, something was seriously wrong. And as they dug deeper, the name Kendall Francois started to come up more and more. But catching him, that would be a whole other story. The Francois house wasn't anything special from the outside. It was one of those places you drive by without giving it a second thought. But inside, it was a different story. Kendall's room was the epicenter of something truly horrifying. The stench that filled the house, the one his family brushed off as a dead animal or bad plumbing, was something far worse. It was the smell of death. Kendall had turned his room into a tomb. The women he lured there, they never left. He would strangle them, sometimes taking his time, other times acting quickly. But every time, it ended the same way, and once they were dead, he didn't dispose of the bodies. Instead, he kept them in his room, hidden from the world, but not from the ever-growing smell that started to seep through the house. His family noticed, of course, but they never asked too many questions. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they were too wrapped up in their own lives. Either way, Kendall's secret stayed safe, but he was getting sloppy. The smell was getting worse, and the disappearances were becoming too frequent to ignore. The police were starting to piece things together, but without solid evidence, their hands were tied. As the months dragged on, Kendall's behavior grew more erratic. He wasn't just killing anymore, he was collecting. The bodies piled up in his room, each one a silent witness to his madness. The room itself became a prison, not just for the women, but for Kendall too. He was trapped by his own actions, and the weight of what he'd done was starting to crush him. But still, he kept going. The more he killed, the more he needed to kill. It was like a drug, and Kendall was addicted. He knew the police were closing in, but he couldn't stop himself. Each new victim was just another fix, another way to keep the darkness at bay. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. And it did. The police, after months of investigation, finally had enough to move in. They arrived at the Francois house, knocking on the door with a warrant in hand. Kendall's time was up, and he knew it. When they searched his room, what they found shocked even the most seasoned officers. The bodies, the filth, the overwhelming stench. It was like stepping into a nightmare. Kendall was arrested, and the truth about what he'd been doing finally came to light. The town of Poughkeepsie was rocked to its core. How could this happen here? How could someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, commit such heinous acts? The answers wouldn't come easy, and the scars left behind would take years to heal. Alright, let's catch our breath and recap what we've uncovered so far. We started by getting to know Kendall Francois, a man whose early life was filled with struggles and warning signs that something dark was brewing beneath the surface. Then, we traced the eerie pattern of disappearances that started to plague the town of Poughkeepsie, with vulnerable women vanishing without a trace. We explored how the community and law enforcement were slow to connect the dots, allowing Francois to continue his horrific spree. But, as the pieces begin to come together, the true horror of what was happening inside his home starts to emerge. When Kendall Francois was finally brought to trial, the whole town of Poughkeepsie held its breath. The details of his crimes were laid bare for all to see, and they were worse than anyone had imagined. The prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted a picture of a man who had preyed on the vulnerable, who had killed without remorse, and who had kept his victims' bodies like trophies. Kendall, for his part, didn't put up much of a fight. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, but even that didn't bring much comfort to the families of his victims. They wanted justice, sure, but more than that, they wanted answers. Why had he done it? What had driven him to commit such atrocities? But Kendall didn't have any answers to give. He was a man consumed by his own darkness, and there was no explanation that could make sense of what he'd done. The trial was quick, as far as these things go. Kendall was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a relief to some, knowing that he'd never be free to hurt anyone again, but for others, it wasn't enough. The wounds he'd inflicted on the town, on the families of his victims, they wouldn't heal easily. It was like a shadow hanging over Poughkeepsie, one that would take years to lift. After the trial, life in Poughkeepsie tried to return to normal, but things would never be the same. The Francois house, once just another run-down home on a quiet street, was now infamous. People avoided it, crossing the street rather than walking past. The stories of what had happened there became legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Kendall's family, they were left to pick up the pieces. his parents and sister. They hadn't known what he was doing, but that didn't stop the looks, the whispers. They were pariahs in their own town, and eventually, they moved away, trying to escape the stigma that clung to them like a second skin. But no matter where they went, they couldn't escape the shadow of what Kendall had done. Years passed, but the memory of Kendall Francois and his horrific crimes lingered in Poughkeepsie like a shadow that never quite faded. The town tried to move on, to heal from the wounds left by the discovery of a serial killer in their midst, but some scars run too deep. For many, especially the families of his victims, life would never return to normal. The house where Kendall had lived and committed his atrocities stood empty for a long time. It was an eerie sight, avoided by most in the community who knew what had happened there. Eventually, the house was torn down, as if by erasing the physical structure, the town could somehow erase the memories of what it had contained. But buildings are easy to destroy, memories are not. For those who lost loved ones to Kendall's twisted actions, the pain remained sharp. The trial had ended with Kendall receiving life in prison, ensuring he would never walk free again, but that wasn't enough to bring closure. There was always the question of why he had done what he did, and why no one had noticed sooner. These questions haunted the families, lingering in the quiet moments and the empty spaces where their loved ones once were. Kendall's name, once spoken with fear and disgust, began to fade from daily conversation. The town wanted to forget, to bury the nightmare and move on. But every so often, someone would mention him, or the old house, or one of the victims, and the memories would come rushing back. It was a reminder that some things can't be forgotten, no matter how much time passes. In prison, Kendall became just another inmate, his notoriety dwindling as newer stories took the spotlight. But for the people of Poughkeepsie, he would always be the monster who had hidden in plain sight, the quiet giant who had harbored dark secrets. His crimes became a part of the town's history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overlooking the warning signs, of assuming that evil could never find a home in a place like theirs. The Francois family, who had unknowingly lived with a killer, left Poughkeepsie. They moved away, hoping to escape the stigma that had attached itself to their name. But wherever they went, they carried the burden of Kendall's actions with them. They were victims too, in their own way, their lives shattered by the realization of what their son and brother had done. As for the town, it eventually found a new rhythm, a way to move forward. New families moved in, new businesses opened, and life, as it tends to do, went on. But underneath the surface, there was always an awareness, a lesson learned in the hardest way possible, that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look just like everyone else. And that's the most terrifying thing of all. And there you have it, the deeply disturbing tale of Kendall Francois, a man who lived among us while hiding the darkest of secrets in his own home. As the investigation unfolded, the full extent of his crimes shocked everyone, revealing a nightmare that no one could have imagined. This case is a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind closed doors and the importance of staying vigilant, even in the most familiar places. As we close this chapter, let's remember the lives tragically lost and the lessons that echo from this haunting story. Stay aware, stay safe, and thank you for joining me on this chilling journey.